Hello, and thank you everybody for joining us today for the debate on meat consumption. My name is Georgina Grell, and I'm the publisher of the Animal Health portfolio here at CABI.
Lovely. My name is Frida, and I am an associate publisher focused on public health. And we intersect today in supporting this transdisciplinary One Health Knowledge Bank that is presenting this debate. So the One Health Knowledge Bank is part of the CABI's integrated offering of resources. And to give a bit more context, CABI is a not-for-profit international development-led organization. We're supported by our publishing division and a scientific research base. CABI has been operating in some form for over 100 years, and our publishing arm supports our international development projects that are improving lives worldwide by providing information and applying scientific expertise to solve problems in agriculture and the environment. And we have many projects touching on sustainable development goals relevant to today's debate, such as zero hunger, responsible consumption and production, and climate action.
Our publishing department provides a wide variety of products, of which there are several searchable collections relevant to today's talk, including the Nutrition and Food Science Collection, Vet Med Resource, Animal Science and Environmental Impact collections. This debate will be available on demand via the One Health Knowledge Bank, and it is inspired by the One Health Journal's special issue called The Dilemma of Animal Source Food. And that is guest edited by our editorial board members, particularly Lisa Crump, who I will now hand over to.
So thanks very much, Frida and Georgina, and we are glad to welcome all of you here today to this discussion and debate. We've shared with the panelists ahead of time a few questions, and that's what we thought we would do is progress through the questions and get their feedback, and then we hope to provoke a little bit of discussion on the different topics. So with that said, I'd like to go ahead and do a roundtable. So asking each one of the panelists to briefly introduce themselves, and then after they introduce themselves, to give us a short answer to the first question that we have, which is how do you see the different dilemmas regarding animal agriculture? And we'll circle through the panelists one by one. I'm asking you to limit your answer to 2 minutes, because we do want to get through the whole program today. So I know that's probably going to be the biggest challenge, because everyone will have a lot to say. But let's start off first with David Barrett.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. I'm David Barrett. I'm the Professor of Bovine Medicine at the University of Bristol. I'm a veterinarian with a number of years' experience in the industry, both in agriculture before becoming a veterinary surgeon, and then I've spent my whole veterinary career supporting the livestock industry. So it'll be clear from that, I think, that you might expect me to have a rather positive view of the industry. Coming on to the question, what are the dilemmas? I appreciate some people would see animal agriculture and its existence as a dilemma. I don't. I think it has an incredibly important part in the food supply chains, but also socially for many people around the world. I think the dilemma is how to produce efficient, affordable, healthy food at least cost to the environment and at a reasonable cost to the consumer. So I think the dilemmas really are in reducing wastage. As a veterinary surgeon, my perspective on that is largely reducing wastage in relation to disease, so controlling disease, optimizing animal health and animal welfare, ensuring that we're not using human edible food to feed to livestock more than we absolutely have to, and optimizing our use of non-human edible foods as feeds for livestock. So whether that be grazed grass, byproducts of grain production such as straw, byproducts of food processing such as waste from the brewing industry or any other food production system that we have. Some livestock, particularly ruminants, have a unique place in being able to produce protein from non-protein nitrogen sources, which we can't do by any other means. So I think utilizing livestock to ensure that we maintain global food supply as the human population increases is extremely important, but we must do that ensuring that it's not at the cost of food we could eat ourselves. So that's really my position, and I look forward to hearing what others have to say on this and the other subjects we're going to debate this afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks for starting us off. Next, I'll pass the microphone to Jude Caper.
Hi, everybody. Great to see everybody on the call. My name is Professor Jude Capper. I'm the ABP Chair of Sustainable Beef and Sheep Production at Harper Adams University here in the UK. I've been working in this area for about 16 years or so now. Trained as an animal scientist, did a PhD, and I've worked ever since, primarily in sustainability with an obvious focus, not surprisingly really, on carbon footprint and greenhouse gas emissions, because that's where we often focus, particularly at the moment. And one of my main messages really is that we shouldn't just be looking at carbon. We shouldn't just be looking at greenhouse gases. I think one of the biggest dilemmas is how to understand sustainability. What are the metrics? What defines a sustainable system? And bearing in mind that we have so many global challenges, global differences in markets, in climates, in resources, in consumer perceptions, that there is no one real sustainable system. What's become very clear is that we need to understand our systems better. We need to communicate them more. We know that about 2/3 of consumers who are thinking about giving up meat and dairy feel very guilty about eating them. And if we could have better data, better communication, such that people could make evidence-based decisions rather than sort of guilt-based decisions, we would be in a better place, potentially, whatever that meant for the animal agriculture industry. And yeah, I think that's it from me.
Thanks very much, Jude. Jenny Cole, next, please. You're on mute, Jen. If you could unmute.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jennifer Cole. I'm a senior lecturer in global and planetary health at Royal Holloway, University of London. I'm a member of the Planetary Health Alliance, and I'm really arguing today from the point of view of the Eat Lancet Planetary Health Diet, which I think is important to state, is suggesting a reduction in meat consumption. It estimates that in Western diets, we probably eat at least 80% too much red meat, but it's not an all or nothing, and I think that's very important. My own personal research is largely in antimicrobial resistance, and as I'm sure you're all aware, one of the largest users of antibiotics across the world are livestock, where in particular they're used as a quick fix for poor hygiene, for poor welfare conditions. They're not regulated as well as they should be. And also what we see in developing countries we're working in is that largely kind of global north style industrial agriculture is pushing for more meat in the diet, which isn't really evidenced by a need from a nutritional point of view. What we've been very interested in is how you particularly maintain small-scale farming, how you don't move everything towards an industrial system that is just pushing people to more and more and more and more because there's more and more and more profit, particularly bearing in mind as you get into the more processed meat, that's really where the health harm is. I'm very aware of if we do move towards a more plant-based diet, there are livelihood issues that go with that, and how we transition some of those livelihoods either away from meat production or making sure we don't transition them toward it in some of the developing countries I work in. I personally am a vegetarian. I brought both my children up vegetarian without any health issues with that. So the health issue, yes, there is scientific evidence that shows that a vegetarian diet is perfectly healthy. I would evidence myself and my children for that as well. But as I think, to me, the crucial thing about this debate is this is not an all or nothing. The planetary health diet is not advocating for a vegan diet, which is often presented as being. At the end of the day, it is people's choice, but there are also, in particular, animal welfare considerations that I think we need to take into account for that. And as we know, as agriculture gets more intensive, that welfare goes down. We need more of the food, as was mentioned, that could be used to feed humans, but feed animals. But we also need to be aware, if we move into a world where good quality meat becomes more important, what impact does that have on the continued production of low quality, unhealthy, highly processed meat for poorer members of the demographic?
Thanks a lot, Jenny, for that. And next I'll give the microphone to Sarah Hull.
Hi, excuse me, I'm just recovering my voice. I'm Dr. Sarah Hull. I am an academic cardiologist and bioethicist at the Yale University School of Medicine. And I think, this is a great segue from Professor Cole, that, from a health perspective, that's really where I'm most qualified to comment, on the implications of eating meat versus not eating meat. Certainly, the data continue to accumulate that the more plant-based your diet is, whole food plant-based, I should say, not ultra-processed foods, the greater the health benefits you can reap. You certainly do not need to eat meat at all to be healthy, as we've heard, and there's more and more data backing that up. But similarly, I also would say that I think it's really important that we avoid an all or nothing stance and really focus on the potential for harm reduction, both in individuals, in human populations, and in terms of planetary health and climate impact, because it's not realistic or feasible to ask everyone to completely abstain from eating meat, and I don't think that's necessary in order to have a huge impact in terms of population health and global health. I will note as well that I think that the importance of food systems and the availability of healthy food is a critical issue in the health of my patients, as I've noticed, and again in the health of populations. That we often in medicine, I think traditionally we focused a lot on individual choices and counseling patients to make healthier choices, but it's become increasingly apparent that a lot of our choices are not just shaped by volition and individual willpower, but they're highly shaped by the environments in which we live and the constraints of the systems in which we exist. And so I think there's really a moral imperative for us to create food systems where healthy, at least predominantly whole food plant-based eating becomes the path of least resistance rather than the path of great resistance as it currently stands. So thank you for inviting me today.
Thank you very much. Next, let's hear from Carla Molento.
Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. It's a pleasure to talk to you all. I am a veterinarian, and I've been a professor of animal welfare for more than 20 years and working mostly with farm animals. I think I see at least 8 dilemmas or problems. Perhaps they're more complex than dilemmas. And I'll use my time to make a short list of these 8 issues that I think are relevant to our debate now at this roundtable. And the first thing is that it's obviously not understandable how do we feed 80 billion animals in an effort to feed 8 billion humans. So there is something odd in these numbers. So 80 billion to feed 8 billion. And then the second point I'd like to make is the forest destruction issue. Of course, this for Brazil is very, very important, but it's important everywhere in the world, not only for forests, but for natural biomas. The destruction of these natural environments for pasture and for crop production to feed these 80 billion animals. The other problem has already been mentioned, also the greenhouse gas emissions. Then we have water use and all the waste that is produced by these billions of animals that are raised per year. There is also the issue of the unfair treatment of animals in intensive production systems, which is the issue I could perhaps comment with a little more depth. Then there is the inefficiency of the current animal production systems as compared to new technologies to make either meat analogs or real meat by cell-based means. there is the problem of the public health risks related to antibiotic resistance, as has already been mentioned here, but also related to the risk of new pandemics, as the United Nations panel for environment has published not long ago. And there is one more problem, which is more related to wildlife existence, which is the amount of biomass that we've been directing to the bodies of farm animals, which is today a big proportion of the carbon that is, composing life on Earth, is now diverted to farm animals because of our food production systems. So these are points that I would like to bring, and I'm really looking forward to interact with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that nice summary, which leads me into introducing our last panelist, Jakob Zinstad.
I have to mute myself, or you would.
You're hearing.
Okay. So I'm Jakob Zinstad. I'm a veterinary epidemiologist, and I'm the editor-in-chief of CABI One Health platform. And the dilemmas we encounter working on One Health, basically worldwide, is that we have a geographical or climatic dilemma that in quite some areas in the world, people cannot live without livestock. For example, in pastoral areas, which are semi-arid or mountainous, you cannot grow crops. And you can also not grow alternative protein-rich crops because it is too dry, too high, or so this is why you can only live from livestock. But most of these people, they live from milk. They actually very rarely consume meat. Many of them would also consume mostly fermented milk products. Then another dilemma is the livelihood. Approximately 1 billion small farmers have made their way out of poverty with small-scale animal rearing. They would have a few cows, a few chickens, a few pigs, and often this makes half of their income. So if we would tell them to stop that, what alternative could we give them to sustain their livelihood? So this is the second dilemma. And a third dilemma is a little bit ecological. I mean, the ecological food chain in wildlife is essentially carnivorous. I'm on the land and in the sea, and we have enormous populations that are eaten by other animals. We have the whole food pyramid, and clearly humanity could not survive without just by hunting. That's no longer possible. So some way of domestic animal keeping, we cannot overcome it. So I clearly recognize that we must decrease massively our animal source food consumption. But from a One Health perspective, we cannot advocate total vegetarianism or veganism, because we would have the impossible task then to provide alternative source of income to 1 billion small-scale farmers. So these are the initial statements that I wanted to make.
Thank you very much to all of you for bringing those questions to the fore. I'd like to move on to our second question and perhaps shine the spotlight a little bit on some of the specifics. How do you see the ethics of eating meat? If we could take the assumption that animal welfare during the production and the slaughter were were optimized, how would you look at the question of the ethics? And first, I'd like to go to Carla, please.
Yeah. Well, there are at least two subsets I would like to make from this question. And the first is the issue about optimizing. So what do we mean when we say optimizing? If we assume that we are talking about the best welfare possible, then we can see that there were lots of improvement in terms of animal welfare in most scenarios, but we can also see that optimizing from the point of view of the best welfare possible, it's not likely in any production system, especially in production systems where animals are confined, such as most of the pigs and the chickens that are raised in the world for food production. And this is because there is a conflict between optimizing welfare and the revenue that the system gives to those involved. So most of the times it's not likely that welfare will be optimized in such a way. And the other thing that we could bring to try and think about this question is the issue of killing. Of course, killing is an intrinsic part for using animals to produce meat. So how can we approach the issue of killing? Yes, we can kill an individual without causing pain. That's perfectly possible from a veterinary point of view. Although it's not so easily done when we think about pre-slaughter processes. There is suffering from the moment the animals are picked from the farms for transport and for the way they are guided to the establishment, the slaughterhouses. But it can be at least optimized again. But is it right to kill an individual who wishes to go on living? And just a little addition to that point of killing, in most production systems, most of the almost 80 billion animals that are being raised each year for food production, they are allowed a very short percentage of what would be their life expectancy. So they're killed almost, most of them before they reach even adult lives. So I think these are points that we could consider.
Thanks, Carla. Sarah, what would you like to add to this discussion about the ethics of eating meat?
Did you say Sarah? I'm sorry.
Sarah, yes, please.
Okay, perfect. So, I agree with Carla's point, which is, the idea that I think it's not so much the killing so much as the life before the killing, the fact that there really is no opportunity for a normal life or flourishing. Normally, as a medical ethicist, my focus is on human flourishing, but I think a lot of animal ethicists would also talk about similar potential for animal flourishing, because animals have demonstrated, particularly more evolved animals have demonstrated a capacity for a lot of the same relational and intellectual capacities that we find are so valuable to the human experience. So I think it's less that process and more the issue of how animals are born into usually pretty squalid conditions and live short, miserable lives. I think from an ethics perspective, from the human side, I really think that we've heard other arguments about how for some people it's not going to be feasible to ask them to stop eating meat, some of these small scale farmers, people with limited resources. And, I think those points are very valid. And I really think that our moral responsibility to avoid meat eating is really commensurate with our resources and our privileges. So someone with a lot of educational resources and financial resources, proximity to healthy plant-based food, that person's obligations to eat a predominantly plant-based diet are going to be very different from someone who's living a subsistence lifestyle and trying to put food on the table any way they can. So I think that really we all have to sort of interrogate what is the status of our own privilege, of our own resources, and the more we know and the more we are capable of eating in a lower impact way, both with respect to the planet and with respect to animal welfare. I think the more we're obligated to do so.
Thanks for highlighting the different contexts. David, would you have something to add to this question of the ethics of eating meat?
Of course, I'll try and keep it brief though. I eat meat, I consume dairy, I consume eggs, so I don't have a fundamental ethical objection. Sorry, what I do worry about though is as is inherent in the question here, is the welfare of the animals during their life and at slaughter. It is true that some animals are kept in suboptimal conditions. It is true that some animals are slaughtered inhumanely. But this question asks, if we optimize welfare during production and slaughter, where's the ethical concerns? And I think we need to be really careful here that we don't, I think we appear to have some consensus in that we think we should probably eat less meat. We should probably eat meat of higher quality coming through optimized as far as possible production systems. That probably means in the Western world where we can afford to, we need to be prepared to pay a little more for it. But it worries me when I hear things like intensive agriculture results in poor welfare. Intensive agriculture can result in poor welfare, but poor welfare can occur in small-scale farming systems just as it can. You know, animals' welfare is not optimized in the wild. So I go back to the question, if we can optimize welfare during production and slaughter, it reduces my ethical concerns or any ethical concerns I might have. And please let's not fall into the trap of thinking that in every case, an intensive agricultural system is bad. Some are, some aren't. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm going to give the last word on this question to Jakob.
Well, I mean, we have very, very high ethical aspirations from animal ethicists who argue that any sentient being, humans have not the right to impose violence or an ill treatment. They compare it to the Charter of the Human Rights. And philosophically, this is justifiable, but what I argue is that we need to bring this into the societal dialogue. I think every society in the world has its perception on the ethical aspect of the human-animal relationship, and that is highly contextual. We need to work really with communities and all actors involved in such a system to find out. I'm involved in an activity that seeks to develop a United Nations Convention on animal health and protection. And I think we should really work on a United Nations Convention or a global consensus to improve animal welfare overall. But we cannot do this only at the academic desk of a moral philosopher. Yeah.
Okay. I was not necessarily letting everyone talk, just in the interest of time to keep us on track. And I know that that's not necessarily going to be the thing that makes everyone happy, but I do want to get through all the questions, and so we'll circle back if we can in time to those of you that are hoping to also have a word. So I'm going to go ahead with question number 3 so that we can stay on time. And that question is, what would be the impact on small-scale farmers if we were to reduce meat consumption? And Jude, I'm going to start the question off with you this time.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I think this is a really interesting discussion. I'd just like to start by echoing David's point that let's not only be balanced in our diets, but in our evidence as well, and not try to assume that all intensive necessarily equals bad or equals more harm for the animal, the planet, or the people. So I think this is a really great question. And if we can assume, and again, I think we seem to be all on board with this, that there are a huge percentage of the global population for which animal agriculture is essential in terms of food, livelihood, female emancipation, nutrient inputs into the soil, etc. But we're talking about smaller scale farmers, perhaps in the Western world. Working with farmers as I do day on day, they are immensely adaptable, immensely resilient. They can do brilliant things with almost nothing, which is fabulous. But I think it's important to understand that the resources the farmers have are not always so adaptable. So in the UK, for example, 65% of our land isn't suitable for growing anything but grass. So we can't grow, you know, okra or quinoa or apples on 2/3 of our land in the UK. And what we can do with that land is to produce ruminant livestock. If we greatly reduce meat consumption, that is obviously going to lead to a considerable reduction in cattle, in sheep, in deer, for example. And we've seen a precedence for this up in the north of the UK. Cattle and sheep numbers were cut in the Highlands of Scotland about 2 decades ago, with the assumption that this would improve land quality. What we actually found was if we take the cattle and sheep off the land, that does have some impacts, but it also has some really negative environmental impacts in terms of letting the grass get too high, because obviously it isn't being grazed. If the grass gets too high, then ground nesting birds can't nest. So we get a decrease in bird biodiversity. Fairly obviously, if we take the grazing animals off the land as well, we have less dung inputs into that land. If we have less dung, we have less dung beetles, and those beetles not only provide the larvae for the ground nesting birds to eat, so there's that circle there and between the beetles and the birds, but they also have really huge implications in terms of maintaining and improving soil quality, soil health and soil structure. And let's not forget that for almost all of us, unless we literally only eat fish, all of our food does come from the soil. So I think we've got to bear in mind the immense role of ruminants in terms of maintaining soil quality globally. And if we take them out of the equation, we could potentially increase our reliance on inorganic inputs, which would have a huge carbon cost, as well as many other costs besides.
Yeah, thanks for bringing the interconnectedness. And I think it also highlights something that we see so often in these integrated approaches is just unintended consequences. And they really need to be valued and considered. David, I also had you down for this question. Do you have something additional to add? If not, we can.
Very briefly, I'm going to leave small scale farming globally for others. I think Jacob's probably got more to say on that than me, but certainly from a UK and European perspective, I think meat consumption would have to fall extremely low before small scale producers needed to be taken out of the industry. I don't think it's the amount of meat that people are eating which is changing farming practices. I think there are many other drivers which have much more rapid impact. So, you know, government policy, for example, if you're a small scale producer of beef in the UK, you can find a market for your product if you differentiate it and sell it direct to the consumer. And that reduces food miles. It connects consumers with where their food's coming from. You'll get more income, which might allow you to improve welfare and all these things we're talking about. So I don't think this is about people transitioning to a new business necessarily. As I say, there are much bigger drivers for that coming through government policies, subsidies, political changes and things rather than actually dietary choices.
Thank you very much. Here's Jakob.
Yeah, I would still, let's say, not challenge, but I mean, come back to the point that was made earlier about human health. And I mean, Mrs. Hull can clearly tell us more about the human health implications of high levels of red meat consumption. And from my point of view, and particularly also from a One Health perspective, I mean, there are good reasons to reduce red meat consumption in favor of public health. And I think this would actually be an optimization exercise, to which extent we want to minimize red meat consumption to improve public health. Maybe somebody of you could address that point.
Well, that leads us nicely into the next question, which is, what is an appropriate amount of animal-derived protein in the diet? Not necessarily red meat, but red meat being part of it. And I was going to pass that question to you, Sarah. So would you like to jump in on that?
Absolutely. Thank you. So, you know, I suppose I would answer that question with another question, which is define appropriate, or how do you define appropriate? But really, you don't need to eat any animal protein to have a healthy diet. And in fact, again, we're seeing more and more data showing that the more plant-based your diet is, again, assuming it's a whole food plant-based diet, the more favorable your cardiometabolic risk profile is, the less likely you are to develop cancer, the less likely you are to develop cardiovascular disease. These are the main drivers. Cardiovascular disease is the main driver of morbidity and mortality in the West and in the world. And cancer is not far behind. In fact, the World Health Organization has classified processed meat as carcinogenic and red meat as probably carcinogenic. And so particularly with respect to red meat and processed meat, I typically advise my patients to avoid those altogether. You know, as others on this call have noted, I myself am vegetarian. I'm actually vegan at home. But I find that can be strict, especially when traveling to adhere to a strict vegan diet. So, but you really do not need to eat meat to be healthy. There really isn't any data to suggest that. There's a widespread misconception that we need to eat much more protein than we actually do need to eat, which is probably only about 0.8 milligrams per kilogram per day. Obviously, elite athletes, you know, pregnant people, there are going to be people for whom that number may not be appropriate, but for most of us it is. And you know, there's also widespread misconception that plant-based foods are not good sources of protein, which is also not true. You know, in soy, lentils, beans, nuts, and seeds, there is a lot of protein. Those foods also contain good quantities of iron and calcium, lots of other foods that lots of other nutrients that often we tend to just associate with meat, and there are a lot of people who have concerns that you cannot get those nutrients from a plant-based diet. But actually, the only nutrient that is not readily available in a plant-based diet is vitamin B12, which is not intrinsically contained by animals, but rather it's produced by bacteria in the soil. So when animals eat vegetables that have dirt on them, they incorporate that B12 into their tissue and into their milk. But B12 supplementation is readily available. It's cheap. Again, I'm certainly not saying that everyone needs to switch to a 100% plant-based diet, but I do want to disavow everyone of the misconception that you need to eat a certain amount of animal protein to be healthy, because that's simply not the case. And indeed, on the contrary, if you look at the data, substituting more vegetable sources of protein and decreasing animal sources of protein is actually associated with a host of significant health benefits, particularly with respect to cancer and cardiovascular disease.
Thank you for clarifying that for our audience. Jennifer Cole, I'd like to come back to you with question number 5. What might be the impact on low-income diets of a greatly reduced animal-sourced food sector?
I think the issue here is actually not about whether it's animal-sourced food or not. It's about how highly processed the food is. And certainly what we see is that the lower down the socioeconomic scale you get, the more unhealthy the food gets, whether it's plant-based or meat-based. A vegetarian burger is as processed and as unhealthy as a meat burger, you know, if not more so. And we see that in most of my work is in the global south, and we see that in the global south as well. The cheaper food is, the more likely it is to have high salt content, to have high fat content, to be deep fried. So I think, again, this is something that can easily deflect away from the meat or non-meat diet. I mean, what we need to do all round is to be eating more fresh food, whether that is plant-based, fruit-based, you know, just moving away from that. And I think one of the biggest dangers that we can do if we're trying to encourage people away from a meat-based diet because of the environmental benefits, which seems to be the message that is coming through, to kind of be vegan for the sake of the environment. That we don't do that by producing fake sausages, fake burgers that are wrapped in plastic that have just as much of a carbon footprint and just as much as a lack of sustainability as any other food. And I think this actually ties in very much with about what we said about the small scale farming. I think small scale farming is the same issue. Once you go to small scale farming, what you tend to have is healthier. It does tend to be a bit more, but it's higher quality. And if you're going to eat meat, eat less higher quality meat. It's less likely to have such a large carbon footprint. We can have smaller farms with a smaller farm to fork carbon footprint attached to them. And so I think this is about, we certainly need to kind of refigure the entire food system in the global north. And again, I think we have to look very differently at the global north and developed cities, as opposed to, nobody is saying that you take a small farmer in the Appalachian Mountains goats away from him. That isn't part of a serious debate. And I think, again, it can easily deflect, oh, well, these vegans are saying that you should, that's not part of the debate. But I think that those are kind of things that we need to look at, is actually moving people towards a much healthier diet in general. And that comes with fresher, less processed. And that is, as we know, the cheaper food is, the more processed it is. A bag of frozen chips costs more than a bag of baked potatoes. It goes across the board, regardless of what type of food it is.
Yeah, thank you. The economic dilemma of what we're discussing. Jude, would you like to add something to the discussion about the impact on low-income diets if we reduce the contribution of the animal food sector?
Yeah, absolutely. I would like to agree with the comments on processed foods and the need for a healthy, balanced diet. Absolutely. I don't think anyone would ever argue against that. I'm going to come back to a comment that was just made, though, about small-scale farms and carbon footprint. As I say, I've been working in this area since 2006. It's a common misconception that small must be beautiful, whether we're talking about farms, coffee shops, whatever it might be. In reality, the best farms have the lowest carbon footprint. And by best, I don't mean biggest, I don't mean smallest, I don't mean most extensive, I don't mean most intensive. The best farms with the best managers, which know how to look after their animals with the best nutrition, genetics, housing, pasture, etc., have the lowest carbon footprint. There are some huge misconceptions and rhetoric about, small equals beautiful. I've been on farms all over the world, some brilliant, some awful, frankly, some big, some small. There is very little correlation between big is bad, small is beautiful. And again, I would, as I said in the introduction, really, it would be really nice to see evidence versus rhetoric. And we see an awful lot of that, both in the media and sometimes in this debate. So yeah, let's get away from big is bad and talk about what we should be doing on farms, which is to simply, on every farm across the world, do everything better with those animals, those resources, that land, and those opportunities. Because every farm's different and they all have their different opportunities. But if we optimize on every farm, whether we're talking about welfare, medicines use, carbon footprint, sequestration, resource use, we can do an awful lot to produce far better food across the world without, as I say, giving into rhetoric.
Yeah.
But I agree with you that it depends very much on the farmer, farm woman, and everybody who deals with the agricultural production, be it plant or animals. But this thing, I think we need to be a little bit specific. Let us take the example of the Netherlands. The Netherlands has such a high density of animals that they don't know where to go with the waste, with the nitrogen and the phosphorus. And in such a case, I should say it's just too many animals. This cannot continue like that. And I mean, the Netherlands have a huge problem at the moment in discussing how to reduce the animal agriculture.
Thanks, Jakob, for bringing out the importance of the specifics of our different examples are really important in this conversation. David, can I turn the question over to you? And maybe you have something to say about the environmental impacts. We've been talking around that, and Jude gave us some specifics. Would you like to add?
Well, that sort of leads us on to the question number 6, I think, doesn't it? Environmental impacts. I'm not an expert on the carbon footprinting. Professor Kappa will tell you a lot more about that than I'm able to. But what I can tell you is, and I would reiterate what others have said, it's about efficiency of production. It's about minimizing waste. It's these kind of things that I spoke about earlier. There's a question in the chat, or a comment in the chat, for example, which relates to the carbon transport cost of food from local producers. And, that's a small part of the overall carbon cost. I think the production is where the big costs come in. I'm not going to focus on carbon, though. I'm going to talk about antimicrobial resistance, because that's one of the areas where I work, antimicrobial use, antimicrobial resistance. And for example, just looking in the UK, we've reduced antibiotic use in livestock production by 60% over the last 10 years, by about 9% for the last year for which we have data, which is 2021-22. And for the so-called high priority critically important antibiotics, those most important for human health, it's fallen by between 70 and 100%, depending on which class of antibiotics one looks at. I just cite that as one example of where, with attention to detail, good focus on animal health and preventing disease, you can reduce the environmental impact. Those antibiotics that aren't going to the animals are not ending up in the environment. Far more antibiotics end up in the environment through human health. And this isn't about them versus us. It's just a fact that we've improved animal health in the UK and reduced the use of antibiotics. I'd also just make the point that meat alternatives are not free of environmental cost. If you're growing almonds to produce so-called milk substitute, you end up with a product that is far less nutritionally beneficial for the consumer and has a cost in its own right. And then finally, grazing land has the opportunity to sequester carbon. There are very few industries globally that can actually store carbon. When we talk about carbon across our global economy, farmers have the opportunity to sequester carbon into the soil in a way that almost every other industry, apart from perhaps forestry, doesn't. So we need to look at agriculture in the round. We should not be singling out livestock agriculture. We should be looking at the whole food production cycle across everything. I'm in total agreement with the discussion that was had about us eating more whole fruit and vegetables and the like, but it worries me greatly, certainly in our society, that the push for eating less meat is coupled entirely with a drive to eat highly processed products that are produced by big corporations who have profit as their driver rather than human health. Thanks.
Yeah, and we keep circling back to the same thing, this idea of balance and looking at the big picture and the whole of it. I am cognizant of the time. We have one more question, which we've largely addressed, about, if we talk about consumption of animal protein, if it would remain the same, what are some things that we could do to reduce or mitigate the impact? And I think, David, you nicely summarized some of those for us. I'd like to invite Carla to jump in and tell us, give us your perspective on that. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. So many interesting things have been said, and I would like to agree to the main points made. Especially the idea that big does not equal bad and small does not equal good in terms of animal welfare. Certainly that's true. You can have lots of animals suffering in small farms, and unfortunately that's not rare to see. But the point I could perhaps bring for this last question is that perhaps there is a big elephant in the room, and this is almost the case when we discuss producing food from animals, which is the biggest comparison. When we think about, for instance, when we talk about vegetarian or vegan diets, and we think about more people transitioning, we tend to think that we will need more production of plants, but that's not the case. If we think about what's happening in the Amazon forest, for instance, to produce mostly pasture and soy, and when we think that this soy, more than 70% of the soy produced in the Amazon forest is to feed animals, that does not make sense at all. If we had a transition towards more plant-based diets, we would need to produce less soy. We need to deforest less for soy production, even if people were transitioning to tofu or any soy-based type of dishes. So I don't believe that talking about incremental improvements for animal farming is going to solve the biggest problems we have right now. We do need to think about other types of diets, and we need to think about other types of producing systems, new technologies, for instance, for people who insist on choosing meat. There must be other ways to produce meat to help with this scenario, even though I agree it's not the best, probably not also the best for human health. So I think that the bottom line here is that maybe I can cite a research that was published in Science, the journal Science, by Poor and Nemesek, where diets were compared in terms of their environmental impact, their footprint. And the difference is huge. So we need, the elephant I'm trying to bring is, yes, we need to improve the way animals are farmed, and I agree with that. And there is a lot of room to improve also in small farming. But we also need to discuss ways that we can produce healthy food that is environmentally more friendly, that is compatible with the amount of people that needs to get access to good food, and that is also fair to animals.
Thanks a lot, Carla, for that, and for highlighting the fact that we have different leverage points, and some are more better levers than others. Yeah, that's definitely true. Sarah, you had your hand up, and I overlooked you. Were you wanting to bring in a point on the environmental impact question, or is your point more related to this one? Please go ahead.
Well, it's more, actually, I'll make a small point on sort of the environmental comment, which is that my understanding, and again, I want to be clear that that is not my area of expertise. I'm a cardiologist and medical ethicist, but my understanding is that most, for example, some of the concerns about soy monoculture, my understanding is that most soy is actually grown to feed animals, and that it's not vegetarians and vegans drinking soy milk and eating tofu that's driving that. But I'm sure there are people with more expertise who on this call who can correct me if that is not correct. But I just want to highlight something, because I keep hearing this, like this claim that the push for more plant-based nutrition is completely coupled to the push for meat substitutes, which I think is really, it's inaccurate and misleading and actually a little bit dangerous. I think that's a very convenient thing that I hear a lot of people say in order to sort of deflect the debate from where it should be. And I've tried to be really explicit when I've said plant-based, I've said whole food plant-based, that and medical societies are not saying, oh, you should eat Impossible Whoppers and all of these fake burgers. No, when we're talking about a whole food plant-based diet, we're talking about nutrition that is predominantly consistent of fresh fruits and vegetables, whole grains, nuts, beans, seeds, legumes, minimally processed soy products, not heavily processed. So tofu, for example, would be an example of something that's really very minimally processed. So I think it's really important not to conflate those things, because I think when your argument is, well, it's a false choice between eating real meat versus fake meat, that's not actually the choice that we're faced with. And there probably, and I also don't know that you can say definitively that eating, a soy burger is actually worse than eating a red meat burger. I don't think the data would support that. I think there probably is marginally less harm from eating the soy burger, although I certainly would not say that is a health promoting food. But if you look at all of the pro-inflammatory and pro-atherosclerotic components of red meat, I just don't think the data bear that out. But regardless, that's not what I and what medical experts are saying is the ideal diet, is switching everyone to eating fake cheese, fake burgers. When we say a whole food plant-based diet, we mean whole foods, we mean real foods. And as a general rule, when I'm talking to patients about what that looks like, when you look at a food, can you tell that it came from the earth, and can you tell what it was when it was in the earth? That's not always going to apply, of course, but that's the kind of diet that is going to really provide the best nutrition in those cases. Am I saying that everyone has to adhere to 100% whole food plant-based diet? Absolutely not. Again, I think let's not make perfect the enemy of the good, but let's also not lose sight of the fact that the more we can move as individuals and as societies toward a predominantly whole food plant-based diet, I think the better our health outcomes will be. I think the data is extremely clear on that. And the data in terms of the environmental impact of less of a carbon footprint from the food that we eat is also really important. So I think it's really important not to conflate vegan junk food or vegetarian junk food with what we're actually pushing for, which is whole food plant-based nutrition. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this last statement. And I think we come to have to close this call, but I'm very, very happy with this first blog that we had on this topic through the CABI One Health platform. And I think it is very important that we had a differentiated discussion. It's not a black and white situation. It is definitely contextual and dynamic and specific, high specificity of the question that we have to address when we speak about animal agriculture and also animal source food in different parts of the world. And I would say, as CABI has really a global orientation, very much so also to low-income countries, I think we have to be careful that we cannot dump everything in one basket. We have to look at it from the different points of view. I think that's not the last discussion we had on this topic. Future discussions on the question of animal source food consumption should take place, and I hope that some of you could again participate. Thank you very much for your participation this time.
Yes, and I would echo, we are running out of time, and we've committed to finishing on time, but I want to invite each one of you to, in addition to thanking you for participating today and bringing in all your good points, to contribute a comment to our open special issue. We'd love to read more about the evidence that you told us about and shared with us today, and hopefully we will have additional debates on this topic. But thank you very much for participating today. I would also like to invite the audience, those of you who haven't been able to comment, that you can comment as well. And I'll ask Georgina or Frida to tell us how you might be able to do that in specific, and they get the last word.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you to all our panelists. It's been an absolutely fascinating hour. I can't believe it's the hour has gone. This is really a start of the debate, and I think what it's done is raised many interesting questions. So we will certainly be following up. This debate will be available on the One Health Knowledge Bank, so please share it with your friends and colleagues, and we will be following up with a written commentary, and we hope then that everybody will be able to expand on what they've been saying today. Any further questions that people watching might have, please let us know, and we will see if we can include those then in the commentary that we follow this up with. Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think having all these different experts showing a real need for a One Health approach, because there's so many different points of views that were brought out from different experts that are working in different areas. So yeah, I'll echo what Georgina has said and say that it would be great to hear more through commentaries and other ways provide the One Health Knowledge Bank and the One Health Journal. Take care, and thank you all so much for joining.
Thanks again for hosting. It's been really good talking together. Bye-bye.
Take care.